I'm Jodie McVernon. I'm a public health physician and epidemiologist and Director of Epidemiology at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne. I was delighted to be a member of the committee and to work with Jenny to really help to recognise her amazing vision for this meeting.
Yeah, I'm Jenny Herz. I'm the co-founder and director of Biointelect, which is a life science consulting firm, and we help companies step by step to bring their innovation to life all the way along the value chain. So I've also been the chair of the programme committee for this conference. The delegates of this conference came from all parts of the ecosystem. So we had industry, including all of the vaccine companies that are operating in Australia. We had some of the service providers that support the work they do. We had major research institutes, universities, basic researchers and clinicians that work on the development, research and development of new vaccines. We had state and federal government, and we also had peak bodies and professional organisations such as the Immunisation Coalition, who are involved in advocacy for all parts of the immunisation ecosystem.
And that was reflected in the sponsorship, which, as you say, was 50%
Yes.
split public-private, which was great.
I think what's interesting is it's the first national event of this kind that has brought all those groups together, specifically on the topic of vaccines and immunisation. And as Jodie said, it was pretty much half funded by the public sector and half by the private sector. The reason we convened the conference is actually that most of the people that work in the vaccine value chain only work in one part of it. And what we needed to do was make sure everybody did understand the end-to-end process and get a greater appreciation of, I guess, the perspectives of all of the different actors in the ecosystem. And so the end-to-end value chain really starts with discovery, the discovery of an idea of a new vaccine, through to research into choosing the best candidate, then product development to develop that product so that it's ready for human trials, then the clinical trials, phase 1, 2, 3, the regulatory process, the reimbursement process, and then the implementation to make sure that it gets to the community, which is where it's needed. And our vision was to bring all of the leadership together of all of those parts of the ecosystem in a national event.
And the really nice part of that too, I think, as someone who comes from the population perspective and policy, was it was also incredibly clear that even at that very early discovery development stage, that be informed by the community. That really we needed to understand the community's views on disease, their needs, their priorities, and bring them along on this journey, because otherwise we can make all of the products in the world, but if they don't get into arms because people don't accept them or don't believe in their value, we won't actually achieve that end goal of saving lives.
If we start at the challenge of inventing a new vaccine and commercialising it, we have challenges in Australia, and globally in fact. There's a so-called valley of death, which is the challenge of getting a promising new candidate ready for clinical trials, but also getting the funding to enable that, getting the expertise to enable that, getting the GMP manufacturing so that we know it's made in a safe, high-quality, reproducible way. And these are all things that are very difficult to do, and they probably require a greater collaboration between industry and the academic research sector than what currently exists in Australia today. So one of the things we really wanted to do was explore new ways of collaborating and enabling vaccine product development and commercialisation.
I think too, just the value of people being together. I mean, we heard very candid stories of early phase developers who suddenly found themselves on the threshold of having to go to that next step, and the learning journey that it was. So I think getting everybody together in a process like this is important, but also understanding where the technical, the regulatory, the funding barriers are, and looking at the way the ecosystem's currently funded. So even in national competitive grants, we have a lot of emphasis on that early R&D, but then how do we support people to get through those next phases? And there was a great example of the Africa CDC coordinating countries across the African continent, and taking a coordinated approach, saying, okay, where are we each going to specialise? What are we going to focus on? And how do we join those capabilities up so that everybody has some skin in the game and uses their skills and capacities, but then we have products that are fit for our continent? And so that ability to do that at a continental level, can we bring that back to state and territory level, but also with an eye to seeing our regional opportunities and responsibilities.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, what happened in the pandemic is that everybody was aligned around a common purpose, and many of the barriers that we've just talked about kind of fell away. And so we were able to accelerate many things to get COVID-19 vaccines into Australia. But as we sort of return to a business as usual, some of those barriers are cropping up again. And what we wanted to do It feels like just the perfect moment with momentum after the pandemic to bring the community together and make sure that we can, enable this collaboration going forward. And what's particularly challenging in Australia and globally, but vaccine development and commercialisation and implementation is complex. And it's particularly complex in a federated system. We heard a lot about that today. And at the moment, it feels like we have probably more funding and momentum and impetus than we've ever had before in an environment where some of the consumer equity issues are more challenging, and also where probably there's more competition than collaboration in some cases, and so we're not really playing to our strengths. And really the bottom line for this conference is how do we get the best bang for our buck so that Australia competes the best way it can in a global value chain so that Australians and people in the region can benefit from new vaccines.
H1N1 was interesting as a test case because it was kind of helpful and unhelpful. It was the pandemic that everybody said, oh, well, it was a mild thing. And at the beginning of COVID, there were still the naysayers who believed we'd just be overreacting again. So I think the compare and contrast between those two was an early response is always warranted because you aren't always certain just exactly how things will play out. As Jenny said, we saw an enormous national, global, coordinated effort to make things happen in an expedited way, and we saw what was possible. I think it was also fair to reflect on the human cost of doing things at speed, and that was actually noted. So it's not realistic to think we could do everything like that again. But we did highlight, those areas and processes where it was possible to simplify without compromising quality and safety and all of the things that we know must be there for products that are put in to prevent disease in healthy people. So there's a very high bar for vaccines in that regard. I think one of the things that we've probably knew from H1N1 and learned again in COVID is that we do have a lot of challenges in Australia in being able to get the information that we need to support decision making. And, we have the complexity of a federated system. We have national coordination mechanisms, and those national committees met very regularly through the pandemic to share information and knowledge. But it was definitely a gap that was highlighted, and the establishment of a National Australian Centres for Disease Control, was intended to address some of those lessons learned, and we're still waiting for that entity to really develop its full capacities and vision. We're in an interim phase. It's great that we've just had the announcement of a national immunisation strategy and a consultation on that within the ACDC envelope. It will be really important to make sure we undertake the necessary mapping, but also overcome some of the legal and regulatory barriers that stop us sharing information that is needed to support Australia's response to these sorts of challenges. So I think there's a lot to be learned, there's progress to be made, and we've highlighted some of those gaps, but it's going to be really important to start addressing them.
Yeah, and maybe just again on the commercialisation side, I think there was some real innovation that happened because of the disruption caused by the pandemic. So as I think the world knows, a lot of money was thrown at vaccine manufacturers and developers to do things in parallel. So we were able to accelerate the normal development times, not by cutting corners and not by cutting any standards on safety, quality or efficacy, but by doing things in parallel with the funding to do that. And so, for example, the fact that the COVID vaccines were all registered in Australia using the provisional pathway. So that's now tried and tested, and it worked very well. It served us well, and perhaps that gives us now a baseline to explore innovative pathways to help accelerate access to other technologies and medicines. So that's just one example. Another one would be that Australia's share of global clinical trials grew significantly in the pandemic because many other countries that were having had a greater problem with COVID disease were unable to keep clinical trials open. We did many more clinical trials in that period, but we also had some innovations such as remote monitoring and different ways of recruiting and some decentralised trials. So there's now a lot of momentum to see how can we grow our share of clinical trials further. And that's great for patients getting access to new medicines, but also creating new jobs and keeping a vibrant industry. We looked at a report by Bio that showed how much venture capital is available for funding oncology products compared to infectious diseases, and it's stark. So it's many-fold higher for oncology products. So I think what's really interesting for infectious disease products and it's probably true of therapeutics and diagnostics as well as vaccines, is that sometimes the market potential is limited and it's not as attractive to the private sector. So more than anything, it needs collaboration between public and private sector so that you address the unmet need. And what I always like to think is, it doesn't really matter what it costs to develop a product or who's going to pay for it. You still have to work out those economics. And then if it turns out that it's not attractive to the private sector, what you need is to look for different ways of funding that innovation, which might be through NGOs, through philanthropy, or through public money. But the job you've got to do is the same. It's just that the level of collaboration needed is more acute. So I think we probably need more public-private partnerships. I don't believe there are any really in the Asia-Pacific region. There's certainly not one in Australia. And if we really want to harness all our research strengths, then we should look at the model that they have for Group A strep, so the Australian Strep A Vaccine Initiative, and think, well, how can we enhance public-private partnerships to get, I guess, those diseases where there's really a significant unmet need but maybe not a huge market, how can we develop those products as well?
And I think, at a government level and in thinking about, what is the case for investment, it's back to more than just an economic outcome for something that might affect a relatively small population. But, how do we value health equity? How do we value, as a society, our ethical obligations to overcome past wrongs, in a sense? So, where there's a 55-fold higher risk of rheumatic heart disease and it's a preventable disease that no longer affects the majority of Australians, what is our ethical obligation to go forward and to address that need? And, it's a need in Australia where we have the highest incidence of rheumatic heart disease in the world, but also there are regional neighbours who similarly share that burden, and, how then can Australia contribute to that equity goal?
And I think this also does talk to then some of the delays that we see in availability of vaccines on the National Immunisation Programme. We have a robust process, but it really takes too long. So it can take 3 to 4 years from getting a vaccine approved by the regulatory authority through to actually getting implemented. And so there's a current review of the methodology and the processes for how vaccines are evaluated. But what we know is that we need to have a system that's able to deal with different vaccines for different populations in different circumstances, so that we can accelerate that access and make sure they get where they're needed as soon as possible.
And I think what was highlighted, as desirable, looking at the JCVI example, was of having a proactive strategic approach to determining what vaccines are the priority for our population, and then thinking about them in advance, making the burden case, the impact case, in advance of that process, and really being well prepared to do that evaluation informed by evidence, and to make sure we have the evidence we need to do that.
We have a unique opportunity at the moment with policy change. So the National Health and Medical Research Council is going to be developing a national research strategy. So that's an ideal opportunity to look at, in the case of infectious diseases, well, what are the priority pathogens? What are the unmet need? What's being delivered elsewhere in the world? And what should we focus on in Australia? So I think if we had more targeted research funding, and then product funding that's directed particularly at product development with industry engagement and collaboration, that would be fantastic. And then working with the public health community, which is where Jodie's expertise fits, is how do we then enable generating the evidence early enough that by the time that product gets approved, you know exactly which populations it should be used in, its value, and that we can implement much more quickly. I think maybe this is where the public sector could take some lessons learned by the private sector. Actually, they need to get better at marketing themselves. We need to bring together the national capability. We need to sort of map it, identify it, and promote it, because we're a long way away and people don't know everything that we can do here and how well we can do it. So we need to have a national approach. We need to not be presenting what my state or my institution or my precinct or my hospital can do, but what Team Australia can do. And then I think the international community will listen, will step up, will recognise the great strength and opportunity there is to work with Australia, and we'll find our relevant place in the value chain.
Yeah, I was quite encouraged to hear that Belgium, with half our population, is such a big hitter, because, we think, oh, we're little and we're so far away from everyone, but actually it's not that
it can
far.
be done.
And it can be done.